Rome has been many things throughout history. It was the capital of the Roman Republic, it was the capital of the Roman Empire, and after that, it was the city of the popes. But all of these phases didn't just appear out of thin air. They were the result of deep changes that scarred the city, deconstructed it, destroyed it, and rebuilt it. Rome is a corpse on a corpse on a corpse. It's a city built over its own destruction, a phoenix that was reborn again and again. Today we're going to go through one of the greatest transformations Rome ever went through. From empire to fall, to rise again, not as the beating heart of an empire, but as the center of Western Christianity. Let us get into the new phase of the Eternal City. By the 4th and early 5th centuries, Rome was no longer the administrative heart of the empire, but it remained its beating soul. The emperors had moved their courts to Milan and Ravenna, safer from barbarian invasions, but Rome still held an unmatched prestige. It was the city of Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine. Well, before Constantine built his own Rome. The Eternal City, whose streets were lined with the triumphal arches of the emperors long dead. Its people, perhaps as many as 800,000, still walked beneath towering monuments, bathed in grand terme, and gathered in massive arenas to cheer their champions. Roman civilization had not yet collapsed. If anything, it still projected opulence, power, and continuity. Yet, beneath this dazzling surface, unseen fractures had begun to spread. But we today are only interested in Rome itself. And even in the late Empire, Rome's skyline was a wonder of the world. The Colosseum, though centuries old, was still in use, hosting public spectacles of various kinds depending on the time, and depending if at the time the gladiatorial games were still in use. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, still saw Rome as the ultimate city of splendor. Rome, the mistress of the world, shining in the brilliance of many magnificent structures, her riches so vast that if all her treasure were heaped into one mass, it would exceed all human calculation. The heart of the city was still the Forum Romanum, where politics, commerce, and law intertwined. Senators still met in the Curia Julia, though they now wielded little real power. New imperial basilicas were erected, and close by the column of Trajan, wrapped in intricate carvings depicting his conquest of Dacia, stood as a reminder of Rome's military might. The temples of Rome, though increasingly overshadowed by Christianity, were still awe-inspiring. The Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian nearly 250 years earlier, continued to be one of the most remarkable structures in the empire. Its massive dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world today, seemed to float above worshippers, a testament to Rome's engineering genius. Nearby, the Temple of Venus and Roma, the largest pagan temple in the city, stood in solemn grandeur. The emperors of the later empire had not neglected Rome. Even as the imperial court resided elsewhere, they continued to pour resources into the city, reinforcing its walls, building new structures, and restoring old ones. The Aurelian walls, built in the late 3rd century, now enclosed 1,400 hectares, making Rome one of the best fortified cities in the world. By the early 5th century, they had been further strengthened by Honorius, who doubled their height and added defensive towers. And yet, Rome was vulnerable. You can have as many fortifications as you like, but if you have a huge population and a huge area to defend, you need a lot of troops to do so. Constantine, despite shifting imperial focus to the east, had left Rome with a new religious landscape. He commissioned the Grand Basilica of St. John Lateran, San Giovanni in Laterano today. the first major Christian church in Rome, and more significantly, St. Peter's Basilica, the first version of it, of course, constructed over what was believed to be the Apostles' tomb. Rome was changing. The old gods had begun to fade, but the city itself was still standing. Now, before we go on to the fall, let's talk about life in the Eternal City in late imperial times. Though inequality was stark, even the lower classes expected certain benefits. After all, in an empire where being Roman citizens didn't really have many privileges left, to live in Rome was the greatest privilege of all. Through the annona, the state grain distribution, one would gain free food. Of course, free entertainment was provided, and through structures such as the Bath of Diocletian, completed in 306 AD, one would gain access to free healthcare, relaxation, and socialization. Rome was stocked with fresh water by many aqueducts, old and new, such as the Aqua Claudia, the Aqua Marcia, the Aqua Virgo, still operational, feeding the city's elaborate network of public fountains and private homes. But it wasn't all great. Crime was an extreme reality in Rome. Though the city had its vigiles, a kind of night watch, certain districts were notorious for robberies, especially after dark. Again, we listen to Ammianus Marcellinus. Throughout the city, men of the lowest class roam in bands, their arrogance unchecked, their crimes unpunished. So, even with some darkness, Rome was a beautiful place to live in. At least, until it wasn't. And so we get to the fall. The empire itself, in the early 5th century, was unraveling. The legions that had once secured the frontiers were stretched thin or recalled entirely. Barbarian tribes, once controlled through diplomacy and force, now moved unchecked into Roman lands. And in 410 AD, for the first time in 800 years, Rome, the city that had conquered the known world, was conquered itself. This was no ordinary sack. This was the moment the world realized Rome was no longer invincible, and if Rome can perish, what can be safe? The man responsible for this disaster was Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Once a federate of Rome, he had fought under Theodosius I, but the empire had failed him. After years of being denied land and proper recognition, he turned against Rome itself. In 408, he marched on Italy, and soon after, on Rome. Scared, the emperor had abandoned Rome for Ravenna with his legions, leaving the city undefended. The people starved. Alaric surrounded the city, cutting off its supplies. The grain ships from Africa never came. The great Horea, the granary once stocked with food, was empty. The people, so accustomed to the annona, had no idea of how to survive without the state provisions. The famine became so severe that in their desperation, people resorted to eating the most revolting things. The gate finally opened in August 410. For 3 days, Alaric's men flooded the city, and Rome burned. Though Alaric forbade the destruction of churches like St. Peter's, his men still looted them. The palaces of the aristocracy were ransacked, their riches carried away. Slaves revolted, joining the plunder. Procopius would later describe the suffering. Women of noble birth were dragged through the streets and suffered unspeakable indignities. St. Augustine, watching from North Africa, struggled to grasp the enormity of this event. He wrote, stunned, "Rome, which had subdued the whole world, is itself subdued." Of course, the sack of 410 did not destroy Rome, but it shattered the illusion of security. The city never fully recovered. With the logistics broken and never to be restored, the population plummeted. Famine, disease, and migration saw Rome shrink from nearly 800,000 to 100,000 people in the coming century. But we're not there yet. There's still a blow to be struck. In 455 came the worst of the Sacs. The Vandals, led by King Genseric, arrived at the gates, and this time there was literally no defense at all. The Western Roman Empire was on its last legs, and its rulers could not stop what was coming. The Vandals entered without a fight. Pope Leo I begged Genseric to spare the people, and unlike Alaric's sack, this one was far more systematic. Over 14 days, the Vandals stripped Rome of everything of value. This wasn't a looting, it was an engineered destruction and stripping of everything, from statues to palaces to everything that could be moved. Bronze tiles, even from the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, were torn off and carried away. The Vandals came out of Rome not only with gold, even from the Temple of Jerusalem, treasures that were brought there by Titus and were never to be seen again. They took even people, slaves loaded on their ships and sent across the Mediterranean that now was under Vandal rule. Finally, during the 6th century AD, the Gothic Wars came. Between 535 and 554 AD, Emperor Justinian and the Ostrogoths turned Rome into a battlefield. The aqueducts were cut, stopping the city's water supply. The baths and fountains went dry. The population collapsed completely, down to 30,000 people. The city was abandoned and left to ruin. The Roman historian Procopius witnessed the devastation. There was no longer anyone living in Rome except for a few wretched souls. A city that had once ruled an empire of 70 million people now barely housed a village. By the 7th century, Rome was no longer a true city. It was a ghost of its former self. Grass grew on the abandoned forums. The Colosseum was used as a quarry for stone because it was far easier to strip old structures than to use an actual quarry to get new materials. The once mighty temples stood in ruins and were cannibalized themselves. A city that had once housed gladiators, senators, emperors, legions was now reduced to a forgotten relic. Its people huddled around St. Peter Basilica and the old churches, living in the ruins of a world long gone. The Rome of the Caesars was dead, a corpse. To visitors from the east, Byzantine officials or merchants from Constantinople, Rome must have seemed like a dream of the past, a fallen titan, its bones exposed to the elements. The Byzantine monk John Moscus, writing in the early 7th century, recorded a journey through what was once the greatest city in the world. He found it haunted, desolate, and crumbling, a place where only the wind and the distant toll of monastery bells disturbed the silence. Even as the empire in the east still called itself Roman, the Rome of Italy was something else entirely. I want you to try and picture what Rome was. Some monuments still stood stubbornly resisting time and neglect. The Pantheon, with its massive dome, remained largely intact, though it had ceased to be a temple for the gods of Rome. It had been given to the Christian Church by the Byzantine Emperor Papacy in 609 AD, becoming the Basilica of Saint Mary and the Martyrs. The Arch of Constantine, once a symbol of imperial power, now stood in the middle of emptiness. The Imperial Forum, at the very heart of the ancient world, was now little more than a wasteland. The temples of Saturn and Castor and Pollux, once glided with splendor, were half collapsed. The Basilica Julia and Basilica Emilia, which had once hummed with the business of empire, were abandoned, their columns used as raw materials for new buildings. The Roman Senate, now a powerless institution, met in the shadow of ruins. But where did the people of Italy go if so few remained in Rome? Italy was now a battlefield between Byzantines, Lombards, and local warlords. Rome itself was impossible to defend, too vast and exposed to resist attacks. And so the people fled. They abandoned their homes, their streets, and their grand ancestral halls, and sought safety in the hills. This process is known in Italy as incastellamento. We could call it the flight to the castles. The ancient cities, mainly Rome, were left behind, and people resettled in fortified villages at hilltop castles. The same villages you can find today driving around in Italy. These new settlements were small, tighter, and easy to defend. Instead of vast sprawling cities, medieval Italy became a land of hilltop fortresses and walled towns. The Rome that remained was something to behold. The people clustered around the Tiber and specifically the old Vatican Hill, where the Pope ruled as de facto Prince of Rome. Wolves roamed the old imperial districts, completely abandoned. Gregory of Tours, our great historian that we talked about with the Merovingians, put it bluntly. Once Rome was great beyond measure. Now it is a city of ruins, where the ghosts of emperors wander in silence. Now, as far as we know, this state of affair, with around 30,000 people living in Rome, lasted for almost 500 years. By 1020 AD, Rome is now the center of the papal domain. But with power not yet centralized in the hands of the theocracy, Rome is a place of competing factions, where noble families, foreign rulers, and church officials fight for influence. By this time, cattle regularly frequents the Forum Romanum. And yet the city hasn't just decomposed, it has evolved. A new area rose from the ashes, Trastevere. Now, Trastevere was already an imperial sector of the city, but it had evolved. Trastevere was one of the most defensible parts of the city, with its own walls, far easier to maintain than the imperial walls surrounding the rest of the city. And during medieval times, it had become a hub in Rome. It was home of a growing population of traders, many of whom are from the Byzantine Empire, bringing goods from Constantinople to the west. The district is also home to a thriving Jewish community, which had been present in Rome since the time of the Republic. At the center of all of this was Santa Maria in Trastevere, the church, one of the oldest in Rome, standing as a religious heart of the district. Originally built in the 4th century, it had been expanded and redecorated by medieval patrons, adorned with new mosaics and relics. Trastevere, more than any other part of Rome, felt alive, its streets filled with the sound of trade, worship, and daily life. Now, as the power of the Pope grew, so did that of the great families from which often the popes were chosen, and so they started to build. Rome was no more a place of grand public spaces, it had become a city of fortresses. Noble families dominated Roman politics and wanted to dominate its skylines too, building tower houses, private strongholds that both served as a defensive position, but mostly as a way to prove their own power in an obvious and immediately understandable way. The Vatican itself was transforming this way. The Leonine walls, originally built by Pope Leo IV in the 9th century, surrounded the Basilica of St. Peter, making it a fortress within the city, or on the side of the city, if you will, since it was still surrounded by green fields. Right in front of this fortress was another one, far more defensible, Castel Sant'Angelo, the former mausoleum of Hadrian, which had been repurposed as a defensive stronghold. Rome was no longer open, an imperial capital of the past. It is a city divided, where every major power maintains its own fortified stronghold. And yet, even divided, unstable, and dangerous, Rome remained one of the greatest pilgrimage sites in Christendom. Thousands of pilgrims arrived from across Europe to visit the relics of the saints, particularly the tomb of St. Peter. This continuous movement of people was the economic lifeblood of Rome, fueling its economy, supporting inns, merchants, and craftsmen who catered to these travelers. Pilgrimage was not without danger. The roads leading to Rome were plagued by bandits, and even within the city factions frequently clashed. Yet pilgrims continued to come, believing that a journey to Rome can grant spiritual merit, penance for sins, and even miracles. Now, going back briefly to the towers we talked about, some were as high as 50 meters and dotted the landscape. They were built from the pillaged stones of ancient ruins, after incorporating fragments of temples and basilicas into their walls. If you look at them, you can see it. You can see the style of walls built by ancient Romans, and you can even see the statues protruding out from the walls, as if lamenting their destiny. In the years around 1050 AD, Rome was divided between rival families, the Tuscolani, the Crescenzi, the Frangipani, and the Pierleoni. The Colosseum was turned into a fortress controlled by the Frangipani family. They had built wooden barricades within the ruins, sealing off parts of the structure and using its arches as defensive positions. The Theatre of Marcellus, another vast Roman structure, had been converted into another fortress, this controlled by the Pierleoni, a family of Jewish origin, if you can believe that. The Pantheon was spared becoming a fortress, but was being surrounded by the homes of the city's elite, who wanted to be near this incredible structure and the important church inside of it. Now, most of the economy around Rome was built to sustain the curia of the Pope and to create a little bit of trade. A lot of this trade passed through the Ponte Sant'Angelo, the bridge in front of Castel Sant'Angelo. And in order to pay, people used a fascinating plethora of coins. Coins from France, Germany, Byzantium, everything that was brought by the pilgrims and the merchants. At least the coin supply was going to continue. Sanitation was one of the areas where the decline was most significant, with the aqueducts cut, destroyed, or just fallen into disrepair. The people of Rome were forced to act just like any other, using wells, the river Tiber, and other, lesser sources of water than what they were used to centuries earlier. And yet the time of complete ruin was coming to an end. The corpse of ancient Rome was now populated, and the powers of guilds and the Pope was rising against the, conservative power of the noble families who kept everything stuck in an eternal conflict, even physical. We are now almost at the end of our little journey in early medieval Rome. But before concluding it, let's take a moment to look into these powerful families one by one. First, the Crescenzi. They were perhaps the most powerful of the families, their dominance stretching over both ecclesiastical and secular spheres. This influential clan controlled vast swathes of territory including the key areas around the Forum. And they even held sway over the Pope's election during their peak. Their fortress, the Castello of the Crescentia, loomed above the city, a bastion amid the ruins of Rome, a symbol of their unshakable hold over the city's politics and streets. Their power wasn't just a matter of military might or land, but a system of alliances with other noble families. In a city where loyalty shifted like the wind, their control of the Papacy allowed them to wield influence over the religious sphere as well, manipulating papal appointments and, in doing so, solidifying their claim to the throne of Rome's street. These were the dark times of the papacy, when its power was mostly local. Yet, even the Crescenzi could not rule alone. They had rivals in the Frangipani, another noble family whose name echoed through the city medieval landscape. The Frangipani fought with the Crescenzi over the hold on the Forum and on Rome itself. They were defenders of the papacy themselves. The imposing Frangipani tower stood as a symbol of their protection of the church. As Rome was fractured into competing fiefdoms, the Frangipani had their own local network of mercenaries and soldiers. Now, most of these battles were fought not on the battlefield, but in the narrow, twisting streets of the city, where the day-to-day lives of Romans played out. In the shadow of these powerful families, the streets of Rome were alive with activity, a place where the ancient and medieval world collided in a cacophony of sound and smell. The market squares, though small and often packed with carts, remained the heart of the city commercial life. Traders from all corners of the Mediterranean Sea, from the Islamic East to the Christian Spain, would bring their wares in these bustling markets. Fabric from Byzantium, pottery from the Near East, and exotic spices from the Silk Road filled the air with their aromas. Now, over time, these noble families and their other rivals began to wield their power less through physical warfare and more through their control of the city resources, as barbarism and slaughter started to retreat from the eternal city's streets. While we can find examples of this kind of fights all over Europe, Rome is very special in this, because the fight was so personal, was hand-to-hand in the streets, it was packed in the city. And from this kind of battle, continuous violence between families, came the Roman spirit, the new Roman spirit. Because the people of Rome were difficult to handle, difficult to control. There was always a little bit of revolutionary spirit in the people of Rome. And it was because of this. They were difficult to tame because they knew how things could go. They knew how violence could bleed the streets dry, even when things started to get a lot better. And so, as we said, Rome was a corpse on a corpse on a corpse. But in that pile of bones, you can find the beginning of the new Rome, the great Rome of the popes. We'll go into that Rome in our next episode. And for now, I'll leave you with the thought of a silent night in a dead Rome that for 500 years was populated only by few. Wind howling through the halls of the Colosseum. Wouldn't you want to spend a night there, just one? I hope you had fun with me on this little journey in the past, and I'll see you soon. Have a good one.